Let's place ourselves. We place ourselves in the presence of our Creator. Let us ask for help that whatever we receive this evening, we will take on and follow through. We ask that our minds and our hearts are opened so that we're here to be builders of the kingdom of our God. We are each responsible one for the other. So whatever we learn, may that be of benefit, not just to ourselves, but to all those we meet. And we make our prayer through our Christ, our Lord. Amen. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit. Amen. We're very fortunate tonight. We've got another two very good speakers. And our first presenter is Father Philip Sumner. Many of you will know Father Philip, but I'm going to give you a little introduction of him, especially for those who have not met Father before. Father Phil is the parish priest of Our Lady in St. Patrick's Parish, Oldham, and he is a canon lawyer, that's a church lawyer. He was chair of the National Conference of Priests, that's Roman Catholic priests, of England and Wales from 1997 to the year 2000. He is currently a trustee of our Catholic Association for Racial Justice, and he's also a trustee of the Oldham Interfaith Forum. He was chair of Oldham's Race Equality Partnership and of Oldham's Community Cohesion Advisory Group for several years. In February of 2006, he was the individual and overall winner of Oldham's first and only Diversity and Equality Awards. Then in September 2006, he was named in a British national newspaper as amongst the top 50 British campaigners, thinkers, and givers transforming our world. The independent newspaper's Good List, 1st September 2006. That's where you can find it if you're interested. He has lectured for UNESCO, Catalonia, on intercultural mediation processes in 2006, and in February 2008 in Brazil at the World Conference on the Development of Cities. He has twice been a witness on BBC 4's The Moral Maze, once on multiculturalism, and once on the decolonization of the university curriculum. In 2021, he was asked to write a chapter of a book edited by John Forrester of Cornell University in the States. The book, How Spaces Become Places, was published in October 2021. So you can see there's quite a lot in there, and I've tried to rewrite what Father had given me. So I hope you've got that. Father Phil is going to start us off on the church's role in combating racism, and he's going to give it to us from a Catholic perspective, or chiefly from a Catholic perspective. Father Phil?
I'm going to share my screen with you now. Hopefully I can find and slideshow. Okay, so can everybody see? Has everybody got that? Hopefully. I can't hear anything, so I just hope that you have. Okay, so it's, as Yogi just said, it's the church's role in combating racism over the past 75 years. And I would suggest that in that time, there are different ages. Perhaps I've stolen this from Tony Sewell in that rather controversial report on race and ethnic disparities. He talked about 3 ages: age of participation, the heroic age, that is the Windrush generation from 1948 to 1970, and the age of rebellion during the 70s and 80s, and then the age of participation, when he suggests almost that everything's gone hunky-dory. I think it's far from that, but that was his 3 different ages. Now, I'm going to suggest that, in fact, with regard to the church, the Catholic Church, there are perhaps 4 different ages. The first one is what I would call the age of rejection through attitudes in communities. Now, I know these are not watertight, and some of this goes on even to today, as some of the things that we'll talk about later will suggest. The second age is that of formally addressing institutional racism and systemic racism without perhaps having a clear understanding of what it all was. The next is the age of changing priorities, with an emphasis given on refugees and trafficking rather than on racial justice itself. And then the 4th age that I suggest, again, these are not completely watertight, but they just help to set things in perspective of one sort anyway. Age of being affected by anti-woke attitudes, denying that racism is still a serious problem. You have The Madness of the Crowds, written by Douglas Murray. And then you have various statements from several of our modern politicians in the Conservative Party suggesting that we need to avoid a victim mentality, the likes of Priti Patel, Kemi Badenoch, and Suella Braverman. So to go to the first of them, the age of rejection through attitudes in communities, I used for this particular age an article in The Guardian in 2002, which used information from Carge at the time. There it referred to a priest told a younger married black couple that he would not baptize their child because you people believe in babies outside marriage and then expect me to christen them. I hope this is not offending anybody, but this is what was said at the time. Another refused a family a requiem mass because they wanted to sing Caribbean song during the service. Another said that he would refuse to have refugees in his presbytery because everything of value would be gone in 5 minutes. And then priests have told Carge, according to the Guardian article, we don't have a problem with racism because we don't have any black people. Obviously, that is very different nowadays, but that was the case back then. And then there was, of course, the growth of the so-called black-led churches. And again, that continues to today. So many of our African communities coming over here experience what they see to be a very different liturgy than their own, and often, all too quickly, find themselves in Pentecostal or street churches where they find something a little more lively and to their liking. The response of the church during those years, well, first of all, I would suggest that in 1965, Gaudium et Spes, a major document for the church, of course, it said, with respect to the fundamental rights of the person, every type of discrimination, whether social or cultural, whether based on sex, race, culture, color, a social condition, language, or religion, is to be overcome and eradicated. Excessive economic and social members of one human family cause scandal and militate against social justice. Clearly, the suggestion is that we are on the side of social justice. Then there was a document in the same Vatican Council, Lumen Gentium, in which the church was very definitely seen as a communion in which we all are meant to participate and belong. And I think that whole sense of belonging is one that, again, I'm going to refer to, maybe not today, but in my next session as well. Then the Easter People document came out in 1980, a document from the bishops, where it was suggested that there was clear evidence at that time of discrimination, and there was an explicit condemnation of the National Front. Then the following year, or even particularly perhaps that year also, there was the response of the bishops that Richard Zipfel referred to in his first session, response of the bishops to the Nationality Bill, which became the Nationality Act in 1981. the bishops gave a lengthy briefing at that time. So you can see that during that time, the bishops were responding quite regularly to different things. In November 1989, the bishops responded to findings of the Commission for Racial Equality and encouraged Catholic schools to make a special effort to recruit suitable Black teachers. And then we in Carge came out with two different charters at the end of two congresses, 1990 and 2003. But also we came out with the document Outcast to Authority, all giving recommendations. But I have to say, I don't think we really followed up on those recommendations to see how they had actually been taken on board by people. The next age that I'm going to go into is that of formally addressing institutional racism and systemic racism, though perhaps again, as I said earlier, without really often understanding it. And that is still causing a problem today. The racially motivated killing of Stephen Lawrence on the 22nd of April, 1993, and the resulting Macpherson report, which developed the notion of institutional racism, providing a definition, and I think more importantly, giving three typical examples. He referred to the colorblind approach. I don't see color, as if that is supposed to be a good thing, which obviously it isn't. The stereotypical approach, which is you think you know what people's needs are from different backgrounds, but you never asked them, you never spoke to them to find out. And the third type, established groups in the exercise of power, where people will say, we've always done it this way, Father. Yeah, but you've got a new community now. People have come into the community and it's changed, so you should be looking at something different. So that's, I think, a very important part of institutional racism. The response of the bishops at the time, this document, Serving a Multi-Ethnic Society, it didn't really pick up on those three elements. And I think it lost a major trick. It went down by asking these questions that you got there. What is the organization's mission? Is it a diverse community? Who does it serve? What services does it offer? Does the organization have multi-ethnic ethos and image? Is it committed to equal opportunities? They're all important questions, but I think it just missed a trick in terms of focusing people's minds on those three elements that Macpherson gave, three examples, perhaps focusing too much on the definition rather than those three examples. In contrast, the report by the Church of England, called To Act Justly, refers to those three examples. It says it could arise, institutional racism could arise from overt acts of racism and or hostility, acting out of personal prejudices, and from inflexible, traditional way of doing things, especially in tight-knit or long-standing communities. That's the established groups and exercise of power. Second one, fueled by a mistaken colorblind approach, where everybody's treated the same instead of recognizing and responding to individual needs. Obviously the colorblind approach there. And the third one could arise from a lack of understanding or mistaken beliefs, from well-intentioned but patronizing words or actions, and unconscious racist stereotyping, clearly the stereotypical approach. The Pontifical Commission for Justice and Peace from Rome in 2001 referred to our need to overcome the weight of history that often impedes the progress of racial groups. A suggestion there, a little anyway, of a critical race theory, the systemic approach, the weight of history on how people eventually find themselves being discriminated against or not. The next document I refer to, and the final one in this particular area, is, of course, Fratelli Tutti in October 2020. And especially, I wanted to refer to three different paragraphs because even though they don't use the same words as established groups and exercise of power, stereotypical approach and colorblind approach, I would say that they could be said to use the same sort of language. For example, their share of the truth, this is in paragraph 15, their share of the truth and their values are rejected, and as a result, the life of society is impoverished and subjected to the hubris of the powerful. I would suggest that is established groups and the exercise of power. Paragraph 218, all this calls for the ability to recognize other people's right to be themselves and to be different, the colorblind approach. And paragraph 129, we are obliged to respect the right of all individuals to find a place that meets their basic needs and those of their families. It's not a case of implementing welfare programs from the top down, but rather of undertaking a journey together. In other words, you've got to listen. That, to me, is the going against the stereotypical approach. So in all those documents, I would say we are addressing some of the things there in that particular age. Then we come to the age of changing priorities. This, for me, is where, because of the wars and famines in different parts of the world, they spark off major and desperate global refugee crises. And in his first visit outside Rome in July 2013, Pope Francis visited the recently arrived migrants on the island of Lampedusa, lambasting the rich world for its lack of concern for their suffering and inveighing against the globalization of indifference. It's a powerful message, a powerful visit. And it saw the bishops of this country taking up the baton, but did they in the process drop the baton of racial justice? They introduced migrants masses. Quite a few of our people didn't like the term, who were immigrants, didn't like the term migrants. They thought it had a pejorative sense to it, and they wanted to change that to something else. But in the process of developing migrants masses, it was very often the very same people who led on the racial justice Sunday masses who were asked to also lead on the migrants masses. And they felt that they couldn't do two. So certainly in our diocese, the racial justice Sunday mass for the diocese just was dropped and the migrants mass taken up. But that then has dropped too because of COVID. The submission of the bishops on integrated community strategy in 2018, again, very much about migration. So the bishops are getting involved, but it's in that area. Formation of the Santa Marta Group, an alliance of international police chiefs and bishops from around the world, working together with civil society in a process endorsed by Pope Francis, who called it an open wound on the body of contemporary society to eradicate human trafficking and modern day slavery. They then, this year, also developed and published a major document from the bishops, called Love the Stranger. Presents a Catholic response to refugees and migrants. It's a 2023 document of the Bishop's Department for International Affairs. Because of our particular history, it says, the Catholic Church in England and Wales has been greatly enriched by those migrating from other countries throughout the ages. And it is a blessing that this process of enrichment has continued in recent years. Suggestion is that obviously those coming from other countries, very often, so many of them are filling the benches in our churches. And because of if it's African communities or Indian communities or Filipino communities, they're staying there. Some of the Africans are going, but the others are staying there because of their particular backgrounds. So they're seeing this as greatly enriched. Maybe I'm making too much of it, but I wonder how they relate in that phrase to the African Caribbean community in this whole process. Apparently, there's a comparable reduction in the focus on racial justice. All the stuff that there is on migration. But there was, I have to admit, a statement from the bishops in response to the killing of George Floyd, saying systemic racism is embedded in our society. And whenever we ignore racism, we are complicit in violations on human dignity. So I don't want to suggest they've not said anything. It's just the focus has been very clearly on migration. And I suggest that they've dropped the baton to a certain extent on racial justice. Then we come to the final age, which is this age of being affected by the anti-woke attitudes, denying that racism is still a serious problem. Now, I referred already to Douglas Murray in the book, The Madness of the Crowds. But there's much more than that. The Sewell report that I've also referred to, when he refers to the age of participation and is critical of critical race theory and other of those sort of things, the systemic racism that is often referred to. Again, white privilege and critical race theory are criticized by Kemi Badenoch. There was this Oxford Union debate led by Konstantin Kisin, which is very much against critical race theory. And I think we have to take these seriously because these are intelligent characters, they're academic characters. And, you know, it is worth reading some of this stuff, but it's not good for the heart sometimes to read it. There's another guy called Tamiwa Awolade, who's written this year a book called This Is Not America. He's saying that he's going very much along the line of Kemi Badenoch and others, critical of critical race theory, and saying things that have come from America, like the critical race theory, you can't just adopt in this country. Yes, he is referencing the fact that the majority by far of Black people with a capital B in this country now are African and not African Caribbean. So it has a different background, and the history there is different than it would be in the America. So those are just being aware of that. But then in contrast, we have Secretary General of the United Nations, Antonio Guterres, referring to the delusion that we live in a post-racial world. And in contrast to the Tony Sewell report, we have the Commission on Young Lives, Part 3 in 2022 by Anne Longfield. She gives a very different picture of disadvantage, showing clearly that the Black peoples of this country are still severely disadvantaged. Then, of course, very recent Casey review on the Met, Metropolitan Police Force in 2023, again, very critical and still suggesting the presence of institutional racism, very clearly. And then there's the Racism and Ethnic Inequality in Our Time of Crisis, and a Time of Crisis, which is a book written by several academics mainly in the North, some in the South, I think, as well, giving the data with regard to it all, and again, showing that it is a time of crisis still. And then the Independent Commission for Equity in Cricket report in 2023, that was just come out, again, showing that it's pervading the world of cricket, racism. So the Church of England, in their response, on my right side, I'm always doing the responses from the churches. Church of England in February 2020, Justin Welby apologized for the church's part in how the Windrush generation was treated, acknowledging that the church had been a hostile environment to those people. He said, there's no doubt when we look at our own church that we are deeply institutionally racist. That's in 2020. Not going to be that much different today. And then a very important phrase from Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti. Racism is a virus that quickly mutates and instead of disappearing, goes into hiding and lurks in waiting. The whole thing of how it has changed, and people can start to criticize and say it's not there because it's changed. It's gone into a different, still very much there, but it's changed its coat. And we need to be able to see how it's changed its coat and help each other to understand how it's changed its coat. And then he says in a tweet, referring back to Fratelli Tutti, instances of racism continue to shame us, for they show that our supposed social progress is not as real or as definitive as we think. The United States Congress of Catholic Bishops, or Conference of Catholic Bishops, in their document, Open Wide Your Hearts in 2018, said that people there in America, the church in America, should be developing curricula, training seminarians and deacons, encouraging priests to listen to those who've been affected. So that's just the more general approach, but then we come to more local responses. In the Chicago Archdiocese in 2001, they developed, first of all, a pastoral letter from the bishop about racism. Then they developed a strategy for the diocese there called Dwell in My Love. And then 10 years later, they look back at that strategy to see how far they've got, to see what they've done, see if they've implemented the recommendations. I think that's an example for us all. In a London parish, Our Lady of Fatima, White City, London, Richard Nesbitt, Nebiat Michael, and Francis Umar all were involved in video showing the example of how it is for them as Black people in the parishes locally in London. Parish discussion in 2021 that was on the website of the bishops. Then in my own parish, when I was in Manchester, that's going back 20 years now, I think it's important that we develop there, for example, work schemes, employing people. I employed about 300 people from the local community. And we developed a system of self-employment so that when people had learned a skill and wanted to develop that into a small business, they could test out their business ideas. One of the churches that I used to be worshipping in, we bought that from the diocese and converted it into managed workspace and created all sorts of areas for people to test out their business ideas. We were alongside the people in terms of policing, not just alongside Catholic people, but alongside the people in the community where it was hurting, especially in stop and search and all these other things as well. And in terms of education, in terms of how we can develop identity nurturing through the curriculum. And it isn't dropping, as they often suggest. I don't mean dropping Shakespeare or dropping, other people within the English curriculum at the moment, but it's about somehow or other being able to include other material where Black people, people from different backgrounds will say, there's something of me there. I understand, they understand me too. And that can be done in every aspect of the curriculum. In my Oldham parish now, we have 4 different choirs. African choir, as you can see there on the screen. We have a Filipino choir, we have an Indian choir, and we have a young people's choir, YCW choir. And they all sing on different Sundays of the month. So that the first Sunday is for the Indian choir, the second for the Filipino, the third is actually for the English choir. The fourth is for the young people, and the fifth, if there's 5 Sundays in a month, young people do it. If there isn't 5 Sundays, they don't do it. The fifth is the African choir, or the final Sunday of the month, the African choir. So they're part of the fabric of the place. And again, part of the fabric of the place are the stained glass windows. We have a Filipino stained glass window paid for by the Filipino community since they've come here. We have a Polish stained glass window with Pope John Paul and where he was born, where he was the Archbishop and the Our Lady of Częstochowa there in the thing. So again, it's about people walking into the church and saying, there's something of me here. And then international music events. Twice a year, we have different things where everybody gets together and sings something that they're proud of themselves. So what have we learned? You can see from my pictures on the left, 5 shocking key findings in the Casey report of racism and sexism in sport, on cricket. And that's not all, there's all the other stuff as well. And we're right to say, along with the Pope, racism is a virus that quickly mutates and instead of disappearing, goes into hiding and lurks in waiting. It's there, and we need to help each other how to address it. And develop a strategy, I suggest, for each diocese. I'm going to come back to this in my next session a few weeks from now. And then finally, share ideas of good practice. For example, that pastoral letter and the strategy developed by the Chicago Archdiocese, and the lament to action of the Church of England, which again, it says, who's going to look at this? Who's going to do it? Who's going to be responsible? When do we look at this in the future to see if we've achieved anything or not? And it's about that sort of approach rather than the one we've often used or adopted. Okay, well, thanks, that's it. I'm now going to, if I can, find my way back out of this. There we are. And hopefully come back to you.
Thank you very, very much, Father Phil. That was an excellent presentation. Very much appreciated. Now, what I'm going to ask is that if anybody present has a comment to make or a question, we have about 5 minutes. If you can direct your question or your comment to Father Phil. And if you are not comfortable saying it and you wish to put it in the chat, that's also okay. You might put it in the chat. So 5 minutes. Richard Zippel.
Father Phil, do you think that Pope Francis's statement racism is a virus that evolves and goes into hiding. Is that a sort of statement that sits well with critical race theory?
I think it is, Richard. Yeah. It's not just critical race theory. There's intersectionality that is also challenged by Tamiwa Awolade as well, and others. There's a whole lot of stuff that's come over from America that we tend to use because I think it's useful to look at structural racism. Margaret Ann did a whole series of the glossary for us just over a year ago now, and it's so much important information there because there's so much new stuff come out. What is unconscious bias? What do you mean by it? All of these things are there in our glossary. What is critical race theory? It's there in the glossary. We need to be able to be at ease with these phrases and know what is meant by them. And certainly the past history of each community has an impact on the way that people are viewed in the present. Even just that phrase, we've always done it this way, Father, which I often hear. You know, that's part of the history of the people in power, the people who had that position of authority for so many years. That's part of structural, institutional racism.
Thank you.
Anybody else want to make a comment or want to ask anything?
Yes, please. Can I say something?
Yes, please.
Right. This is Beverly Pravat Goldstein. I just want to say how warming it was to hear you talk, Father Phil. It was magnificent. In the Northeast, we are struggling to move forward. We often get diverted and distracted by consultation processes that don't actually involve talking to people. So your clarity and your examples are a great encouragement for us to take a radical route. We need help, I think, to take forward.
Thanks, Beverly. Anybody else?
Just say one thing about my
Yes.
experience in Brittany. You know, I lived some years in Wales and in London. To be honest, how shall I put it? I feel as if I'm starting all over again with racial justice, as if I'm a racist and sort of a white person and see people as not very friendly. And I would like to say that every county has a different perception of different people. And I encounter many races for myself and all around me. And just nice to look back, to be with you again and to see you and sort of order myself under you, you know, sort of I was there while I can orientate myself what you're saying and what you're providing for people and where you're standing, you know. And I wish that would be Brittany as well. I wish there would be someone here from you. It's a pity that you don't export your knowledge to France and say, you know, we make maybe church here, Roman Catholic Church from London, and teach us what to lead us forward. It's a wilderness. It's a cry in the wilderness. It's nothing.
Thank you for that, Ursula. I have to say that what you were saying is replicated in this book by Tamiwa Awolade, which is this is not America. You know, every country has to understand their racism in a different way.
Yeah.
But you can still learn. You can still learn from each other as well.
Yeah.
We can learn, I believe, from the American experience. We can learn from each other, but recognize at the same time, as you've just said, that it is different. And I have to say that I have lectured in French myself for UNESCO in Barcelona. in Spain. I know it sounds strange to be lecturing in French in Barcelona, but I couldn't speak Spanish, but I could speak French.
Nice, nice. What is your perception of the French Roman Catholic Church compared to the British and the Spanish? What are you thinking about the French Roman Catholic Church? What level of understanding do they have of racism and perception do they have helping people?
Oh, now you're asking me. I'm going back quite a few years now because
I'm sorry.
I was in the National Conference of Priests for this country, and we had meetings across Europe with the European bishops and other priests and others. And
Father Phil, I'm going to stop you just there.
Okay,
I'm sorry about
good.
this for cutting everybody short, but we have a second speaker, and we need to bring Richard in.
Absolutely.
And also we are going to have another opportunity at the end to share in the discussion. So if I may, I'm just going to ask everybody, if you are during the listening to the presentations, if you want to put a comment in the chat because you feel you might forget it, please do so, or a question, use the chat for that. And now I'd like to introduce our second speaker, who is Richard Reddy. And Richard Reddy is a writer, a researcher, cultural and religious commentator, and broadcaster. Richard has written for a number of publications, including The Guardian, The Times, the BBC Online, the Church Times, the Voice newspaper, Third Way, Reform, Roots, and the Weekly Gleaner. He has also taken part in a number of TV and radio programs, such as Prayer for the Day, Beyond Belief, Amazing Grace, The True Story of the Song, Sunday Worship in Ghana, as well as BBC Local Radio and Premier Christian Radio. He's also the author of Abolition, The Struggle to Abolish Slavery in the British Colonies, and The Groundbreaking Black Muslims in Britain, which was the first scholarly research into this growing phenomenon. This book was subsequently turned into the documentary Young Muslim and Black by BBC Radio 4. In 2011, he wrote the well-received biography of Martin Luther King Jr., History Maker. His latest book, Race for Justice, which he edited, was published by Lion Hudson in August 2022. Richard is currently the Director of Justice and Inclusion of the leading ecumenical body, Churches Together in Britain and Ireland. I give to you today Richard Reddy will be speaking on the 75th, he'll be speaking about the 75th anniversary of the arrival of the Empire Windrush, and he will be discussing the churches ecumenically combating racism over the last 75 years. Richard Reddy.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. So as you said, I want to use my time this evening to explore the role of the ecumenical sort of church movement in addressing racism over the last 3/4 of a century. So 2 weeks ago today, this country marked the 75th anniversary of the arrival of the SS Empire Windrush ship to these shores on the 22nd of June 2023. And for many people, the arrival of that particular ship heralded the rise of multiracial or multi-ethnic Britain. And I worked with a number of colleagues from the various churches and parachurch organizations to host an ecumenical service. It was a national service at Southwark Cathedral, and the service was to celebrate this auspicious anniversary. And one of the themes that the service looked at was the role of the church in Windrush. And I think we all know, and it's all generally acknowledged, that the church was one of the major beneficiaries of Windrush. And this came out not only in the service, but it came out time and again in the various conversations that took place around the celebrations. And people were constantly saying, where would the British church be without the Windrush generation, and how this generation was very much a blessing to the church in this country, and it's something that we should thank God for. But I think one of the things that we couldn't ignore during those particular celebrations a couple of weeks ago was the fact that the church, and this is all the churches, really didn't cover themselves in any glory during the Windrush era. I think Father Phil has alluded to this during his presentation. And at that service at Southwark Cathedral, we heard from individuals who experienced rejection from the historic denominations. Many of them would argue that they were not given the opportunity to put into practice their God-given talents to build up the church, and others found a necessary refuge in Black Caribbean Pentecostal churches, which they saw as being more supportive and helpful towards them. So, you know, if we're going to explore the role of the churches in combating racism, we need to start with Windrush. And it seems that during the Windrush era, the churches got off to a bad start. So, you know, many people, when they talk about the Windrush generation, they refer to the era between 1948 and 1971. And it can be argued that the churches, akin to much of British society at that time, struggled to come to terms with the growing Black and Asian population in Britain. So, for instance, my organisation, which is Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, was previously known as the British Council of Churches, or BCC. And one of the things that it did during the early days of Windrush was to carry out a number of investigations into the spirituality of Black Caribbean Christians in Britain, especially those connected to the Pentecostal churches. What was interesting at the time was that the BCC referred to them as sects, SECTS, which is a slightly pejorative term, even though these individuals themselves considered themselves to be card-carrying Christians. And one of the things that the British Council of Churches did was to pay for one religious academic stroke clergy person to go to the Caribbean to find out more, to find out firsthand about the beliefs and the practices of these churches. And this particular academic wrote a book that was very well regarded at the time, and it was deemed to be the sort of authority on Black churches. Looking back on it now, and as I read it last week in preparation for this presentation, and it's pretty awful, to be honest. A lot of it is quite offensive. And as I mentioned before, at best, a lot of the churches were actually indifferent to Black Caribbean Christians, and at worst, they were hostile. And this was at a time when there was rampant racism in Britain, in various sectors such as housing, employment, health, and any other sort of public policy related area. What was interesting between the period of 1948 and 1971 was the fact that you did find individual white ministers or clergy of their churches that were supportive of Black Christians and Black communities. So there was good practice. And you saw that in churches like the Notting Hill Methodist Church and Harlesden Methodist Church, and other Methodist churches in London and Birmingham and Bradford and anywhere where there was a sizable, particularly a Black Christian community at the time. So you saw good practice, but that wasn't at an institutional level. At an institutional level, the churches remained largely silent on issues that really were pertinent at the time. So, for instance, the church more or less didn't say anything during the Notting Hill, North Kensington race riots in London in 1958, or a year later after the racist murder of Kelso Cochrane, which was the first recorded killing of a Black person by racists. Or it was largely silent on the 1962 British Immigration / Nationality Act or the 1965 Race Relations Act. It didn't, the church themselves, they weren't advocates for the passing of that pretty important piece of legislation. Again, the churches were largely silent after Enoch Powell made his very controversial Rivers of Blood speech in 1968. What was interesting, though, was the fact that British churches, particularly the British Council of Churches, were very vocal on issues overseas that were linked to racism. So, for instance, they were vocal on apartheid in South Africa. They were very condemnatory of Ian Smith's regime in what was Rhodesia at the time. And they also took an active interest in the United States and their civil rights movement. But when it came to addressing issues of racism in Britain, that wasn't the case. The real change came in the 1970s. And within the ecumenical sphere, the BCC, or the British Council of Churches, established the groundbreaking Community and Race Relations Unit, CRRU, which was established in 1971, and it sought to tackle the issues linked to structural racism and the struggle for justice in society. And the CRRU made monies available through its projects fund to help organizations fighting forms of racism. Many of these organizations were Black and Asian. So they did some very good work. They issued a number of reports with recommendations. But what was interesting was that they were looking to address racism in society, but their approach didn't seek to address racism within the church. That wasn't the case. You saw churches looking to address that in the 1980s. And when it came to the CRRU, it was replaced in the 1990s by the Church's Commission for Racial Justice, the CCRJ, which took a more dynamic approach to addressing issues of injustice in church and society. That organization, was quite radical, and it made monies available to address everything from investigating Black deaths in police custody to providing bail money to those arrested on immigration issues. And Father Phil has mentioned the killing of Stephen Lawrence, and that was very much a kairos moment for both church and society in Britain. And from a church perspective, the Methodist Church, after the killing of Stephen Lawrence, and the Lawrence family attended a Methodist church at the time, initiated Racial Justice Sunday in 1995. And my organization, which was at that time became known as CTBI, Church of Britain and Ireland, embraced Racial Justice Sunday, which was the second Sunday in February, and mainstreamed it, and encouraged all churches to mark this specific day in the year where it was an opportunity to remember the importance of that racism was a reality, to respond to it through prayer and action. We encouraged all churches to actually use the materials that CTBI produced, not on that Sunday, but throughout the year as well. I would argue, though, that there was a change in what we used to call as the noughties. Father Phil has mentioned post-racial societies. And I would argue that the election of Barack Obama in the United States in 2008 saw many people on both sides of the Atlantic argue that we were now living in post-racial societies in which race no longer had the capacity to limit, restrict, or marginalize. And they were saying that if Obama could become US president 40 years after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., all things were possible. And from an ecumenical perspective, what we did see was organizations like the Church's Commission for Racial Justice morphing into the Racial Justice Network, which then closed by 2010. And what we did see was many churches, church denominations who had established the roles of racial justice officers after the killing of Stephen Lawrence. By about 2008 to 2010, those roles became EDI roles, equality, diversity, and inclusion. So the emphasis was taken off race and sort of more kind of focused on issues pertaining to equalities and diversity and inclusion. And I would argue that in taking race off the agenda, the churches weren't in a position to challenge a series of events and activities that were pretty massive in terms of the sort of a body politic of Britain. So, for instance, the churches, I believe, failed to speak out clearly against the Conservative-led coalition government's hostile environment. And that hostile environment led to the Windrush scandal of 2018 that saw people with the right to live and work in Britain being threatened with deportation, and in some instances, people who were actually deported. But what we do know is that those individuals lost their livelihoods, and a good number of them either went to church or had relatives who attended church. But the church was largely silent on that particular scandal. Likewise, the churches failed, I believe, to respond in a prophetic way to the massive spike in reported race and religious related hate crime in England after Britain agreed to leave the EU on the 23rd of June 2016, what we now know as Brexit. The church was also largely silent when it came to the Grenfell Tower tragedy on the 17th of June 2017, and it was invariably left to the Muslim community in London and elsewhere to speak truth to power on this particular tragedy. And then finally, I believe the church was caught on the hop after the racist killing of George Floyd on the 25th of May 2020. You know, I always say that, you know, there was a BC and in old money and an AD in terms of racial justice work. And, you know, in terms of my work before the killing of George Floyd, you know, there were plenty of gaps in my diary. After the killing of George Floyd, my diary's been packed ever since, where people invite me to come and talk about racial justice because they themselves haven't engaged for whatever reason on this particular issue. And I would argue that it's major events such as, you know, the murder of George Floyd, those events have invariably been the catalyst or the key moments for church engagement. So in the 1980s, there were the urban disturbances in the inner cities of England in 1981, and then again in 1985, and the latter coincided with the Church of England's Faith in the City report. And those events invariably witnessed a flurry of activities such as reports, commissions, and even projects. But, you know, some would argue that nothing of real substance emerged from that work, leaving many Black, Asian, and minority ethnic people disappointed over the lack of progress. And, you know, for some people, they were just proverbial tick box exercises. And, you know, Father Phil mentioned from Lament to Action, you know, the Church of England's groundbreaking report that came out again after the killing of George Floyd. And, you know, many people are saying, you know, will this actually deliver the necessary change that, you know, many people want to see within the Church of England? Again, Father Phil mentioned the culture wars, you know, the war on woke and the Sewell report. And, you know, what we have seen, and this goes back, I would say, to about 2010, the rise of Black conservatives, you know, individuals who are conservative with a small c and often a big C, who are keen to engage in culture wars. You know, these men and women see race, especially what they consider to be critical race theory, as cultural Marxism. So, you know, issues like racial justice are part of a war on woke. And the irony is, for me, is that, you know, many of these people claim that racism is no longer an issue, but they actually spend most of their time writing and speaking about race. So if it wasn't an issue, why don't we write on something else? But, you know, despite the efforts of the media and certain opinion formers to promote these ideas, the evidence still suggests that there are massive disparities and inequalities in British society as well as church when it comes to issues of race and racial justice. So, you know, I'll leave it there because I always like to leave sufficient time for questions. So I'll just I'll wrap it up with that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Again, an excellent presentation there. I'm going to now ask Gloria, well, first of all, we've got about 3 or 4 minutes. If anybody has a burning question to ask Richard or a comment to make to Richard, please. I cannot see any hands. I don't, okay. I'm going to ask Gloria to put us into groups. Now, the important thing about going into the groups is the opportunity for everyone to have a say. So we do want everyone to be able to participate in the groups, and we would like one person from each group to report back. So we'll have 20 minutes for discussion and then 10 minutes to come back and to report. So if every group has a reporter who will write down a few notes and report back in about 2 or 3 minutes, please, that would be really, really helpful. May I just say 2 little things that I would like people to pick up on, and this is just my own thinking. Father Phil speaks of the bishops changing after Pope Francis' visit to Lampedusa. And then they came up with the Santa Marta group to eradicate human trafficking. And then obviously they come back on the whole refugee thing in Love the Stranger. But he speaks of them dropping the baton for racial justice. And I found that most interesting. And Richard Reddy then also says that, you know, they've come up with this new term now, equality, diversity, and inclusion. And somehow, even in that, racism has been dropped. So I'd like, in some way, for people to pick that up and to discuss this dropping of the baton on racism. Is that okay? Gloria, if you can put us into groups now, and please make sure that we have a reporter in each group to report back. Thank you.
Can you just be aware of the questions coming through on the chat room as well, Yogi?
Right. Are they questions for us now, for Phil? Or?
Well, what strategic actions do dioceses need to take for racial justice? We will come back to that on the next occasion when Richard and myself are speaking, but you know that.
Yeah.
And then there's an ecumenical initiative, Time for Change in Birmingham, of which the Catholic Church is a member, but there were no official Catholic representatives at an annual event last year, presumably because bread and wine was being shared. Has the Catholic Church got the wrong priorities?
Okay, Father Paul and Richard, if you pick up on those questions when people return, I would appreciate that. Okay.
Okay, we'll have about 20 minutes, I think.
If you can make that 18, Gloria, so that we can have everybody report back, please. And Father Paul and Richard have 2 questions to answer as well.
Okay, that's fine.
Thank you.
Strategic way. So what can be done?
Okay, so
And I hope we're all back. Thank you. Yes, the group work is always very interesting, and I guess we could go on for a much longer time. Unfortunately, we don't have that time. So we'll immediately go to group 1 and get a report back from group 1, please. Margaret, you're muted.
Yeah, I think that's me. We grappled with a few questions around what you said about why has the baton been dropped? And that led to the question of, do the bishops really understand the issues that are in front of them? And where do the boundaries lie between racial justice and migration asylum issues? And do they all fall into the same pot? Or do we say these are racial justice issues and some migration issues are simply migration issues? So we discussed all these things. There was a question of that seminarians need better training, perhaps, on dealing with these issues. And that I think that one of the things that came across was that the need to know what can be done. And I think we have to wait till Father Phil's next talk to get the answer to that question. But in the meantime, I think that the idea was that perhaps people think that people want to feel that progress has been made, and that in order to feel that progress has been made, you sort of sidestep the reality of what's happening now, and that there's a whole sort of sect of anti-woke intellectuals who assert that there is no problem. And perhaps the bishops are caught up in that dynamic, that we've moved beyond the racial justice issues. And I think there was a feeling that these issues must be addressed at diocesan level, but they're not. That's not happening at the moment. So it was actually more questions than answers, but a lively discussion.
Thanks, Margaret. It sounds very interesting, close to my heart. Our group 2. I'm hoping, of course, that Richard and Father Paul are going to answer your questions in some form. Can we have group 2, please?
Keep trying to unmute myself. There we are. Our various experiences spoke of a sense of isolation from individuals from who are aware of their own background, who carry explicitly or silently a cultural heritage which is different from the prevailing one round about, and that can distance people from the main congregation, so that some people feel excluded, some people feel that people of colour are not recognised, and some, they said, I would not put myself forward because it would make me too vulnerable. We felt that the bishops were not speaking clearly enough, had missed lots of opportunities, and that although we can build little bridges, which are important, and they're perhaps the building blocks of progress, that what we actually need to do is to name racism and to own up to the fact that the church is most reluctant ever to admit that it has been wrong, and that because somehow that the whole edifice would fall down if we said we have been going in the wrong direction. But there's lots of biblical examples of people going in the wrong direction and being turned around, which is something we need to do, and feel that naming racism as something that is we need to address individually, collectively, and corporately as an organization. That's it. Thank you. I have finished.
Thanks, John. Can we have the third group, please?
Long silence because the third group didn't appoint anyone to speak back, and I guess we're all hoping that somebody else would. But as I am, and we've got short time, I can follow on quite well from John Duffy, because I think our key point was very much on that idea of the church needs to face up to its responsibility in this area and to speak out, name racism. Equality, diversity, and inclusion can all be understood to include it. But as someone in our group said, racism is a really uncomfortable word. And listening to Richard in particular today, the church, to a surprising degree, refuses to respond to the issues, which obviously are big issues. And the bishops and ourselves and everybody in between really does need. I think we know what we should be doing and we know what the problems are. Just take courage and speak out.
Thanks, Alison. Is there a group 4, Gloria?
No group 4.
Is that a yes or a no?
Oh, no group 4, no.
No group 4. Right now, so thank you very much to the 3 who reported back, and thank you to the groups for the discussion. I'm going to hand over to Father Phil and to Richard. There were 2 questions before we went into our groups, but I think you have even more questions now from the groups. You've got about 4 minutes.
Okay, so for me, the thing about the bishops believing that progress has been made, we all, as the Pope suggested in that tweet, we all need to think that we have made progress, that we're better, we've done better, we've improved in the way that we were from the way we were before. And the reality very often is that we haven't. And the bishops are particularly, I would suggest, very, very, or even the people around them as well, so protective of them in case any suggestion of criticism is made, when really this is all about the synodal process, about people talking and saying what their reality is and saying how difficult it has been for them and getting the bishops to listen. Sometimes those messages are not comfortable messages, but we still have to listen to them and not jump straight away on feeling as though we're being criticized. That is the bishops, and it's us, it's the priests, it's everybody. But you can understand the dynamic of what is taking place, of why it is so easy to drop that baton. And the things, the reports that have come out in this last year, all suggest to us so clearly that we've got to pick up that baton again, that we have to adopt in each diocese something. Now, each diocese will be different. Ursula talked about the situation in France, and there you have all the banlieue, you've got the laïcité approach, and it's a very different approach. We do have a different approach here where there's still the leftovers, the residue of multicultural approach, even though there's a rejection of the term to some extent, but there's still the residue of that multicultural approach in our schools. So we've got, to me, a much healthier approach in the way that we deal with it as a society than the one that there is in France. And you've seen the result of that in recent days. But I don't want to come across again. I could be blamed for jumping into the same thing, the same dynamic I was just talking about, wanting to believe that we're better than France, that we're doing things better. Somebody said that racism is an uncomfortable word when you think of it as, am I involved in that? And we all have to accept that at different times we are, and how we are, and work and listen to those most affected and respond in that way. I hope that answers some of the questions.
Thanks, Father Phil. Brilliantly indeed. I'm going to ask Richard to say what he'd like to say to what he's heard.
Yeah, just I'll try and keep mine short. You know, interesting
Please do.
enough, I'm looking out there, and that's my back garden out there. And at the moment, my back garden is looking great because I cut the grass a couple of days ago. But if I take my eye off that and leave it for about 6 to 8 weeks, it's going to grow back, and the weeds will be there again. And I think that's a good analogy for racism within not only the church but also society. You know, what we tend to see are key moments, Kairos events, and the church response. And it sort of it will throw money, and it will throw time, and it will throw energy at certain things. Sometimes, you know, it's done sincerely. Other times it's almost a tick box exercise. But once that's done, people say, well, job done, you know, let's move on, let's look somewhere else. And I think you can't do that with racism. You just can't do that. You cannot take your eye off the ball, because you know, as you said, you know, His Holiness quoted how it can morph. It's you know, it can change. It's a bit like a virus that, you know, can change in terms of the conditions and the situations. You've got to really be intentional if you're seeking to drive it out. And I think more often than not, we're not like that within the church. You know, we're into quick fixes, we're into easy answers, you know. Hence, you know, for a long while, you know, for many people, when they were looking to seek to kind of encourage reconciliation, it was about having international evenings where, you know, you would bring in a choir, and then, you know, particularly from a Caribbean situation, you'd have eat some curry goat and drink some ginger beer if you're not into alcoholic beverages, and that would be deemed to be sort of reconciliation light. You know, but, you know, racial justice, you know, justice, you know, it's not an easy word. There are no shortcuts in when it comes to justice. It's hard. It's a long, winding road. Somebody quoted John Lennon song earlier. It's a long, winding road. And you know, if we want to get to that destination named, you know, destination point named reconciliation, we're going to have to take that road. It's not going to be easy. It's going to require courage. It's going to require determination, intentionality, and lots of faith. But I think that's what we're called to do. We're called to carry our cross before we seek to wear that crown.
Thank you very, very much, Richard. I'm sure you'll all agree that both our presenters have been absolutely superb tonight. So we would say thank you very much to both of you for the fantastic presentations. I also want to say a big thank you to everybody who's come for the hour and a half. You've all made your own contributions, which are really, really helpful, and we appreciate that. Please check out the next webinar and invite your friends to come along to that too. We'd love to see you again, and we'd love you to bring your friends to it as well. Thanks again to everyone, and I hope you're all going to have a very pleasant evening. God bless.
Thank you, Yogi. Good night.